I want to stay at the start that every single member of this House, whatever view they hold on the fundamental political question before us, is trying, as they see best, to act in the national interests and in the interests of their constituents. The problem, the reason why we are here today, is of course that each of us has a slightly different view of what those best interests are. So I hope that we can debate this bill in what is, I recognise, a very short amount of time. And if I may respond to the point, I could do no better than to quote the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset, who on the 3rd of April in the House said, "It can only be done at high speed because there is no time left." And I think wherever we stand on this issue, we know there is very little time left, and following the decision on prorogation, there is even less time than would have been available previously. And therefore, I hope that we will treat each other, recognising we have strongly held views, with respect and consideration during this debate. Now, the purpose of the bill is very simple. It is to ensure that the United Kingdom does not leave the European Union on the 31st of October without an agreement. The bill has wide cross-party support. Can I say it's a great pleasure to be just above on the order list, the Honourable Member for North East Bedfordshire, and is backed by members who have very different views on how the matter of Brexit should finally be resolved, including members who until very recently were senior members of the Cabinet. Now, you could describe it as a somewhat unlikely alliance, but what unites us is a conviction that there is no mandate for no deal, and that the consequences for the economy and for our country would be highly damaging. Those supporting the bill believe that no deal is not in the national interest. Of course I will give way.
Quick question, if I may, and I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way. When he talks about no deal, there are multiple sector deals. So does he not see those sector deals as being multiple deals in their own right?
Well, I don't know where these sector deals are. Yes. My concern and the reason for this bill and the support that I hope it will enjoy in the House today is because the Prime Minister has made it absolutely clear that he is prepared to leave on the 31st of October without a deal. And those of us who I hope will support the bill today do not wish that to happen. I will give way.
Would you agree that, in a sense, with these debates going on for long periods of time, many of us have tried to learn lessons from them, and in that process people have changed their mind or their order of importance to prevent a no-deal Brexit? One of the amendments today is to give people another look at what we might call the May Plus proposal, where people turned it down at the time, but feel that had it been on the order paper, if they had the experience they have now, they might have voted differently. Might I ask, given with all the rush there necessarily has been, has you had a chance to look at that amendment by my honourable friend, the member Aberfan, which now has quite a large amount of support, that we have another look at that as an alternative to a hard Brexit?
Well, I've not had a chance to read the final version, and it will be tabled with the clerks during the course of this second reading debate, but I'm aware of the intention of the amendments, and I completely understand what my honourable friends are trying to achieve. We cannot continue to delay taking a decision. I shall come back to that point later in my speech, and I will, of course, listen to the debate that follows during committee stage. I would just say this, however, that the bill is deliberately open as to the purpose of the extension, so it provides a framework for reporting and debate, and it is supported, as I've just pointed out, by honourable and right honourable members who have already voted for a deal and would vote for one again. And I would just say it's very important that we focus on the principal purpose, which is to prevent a no-deal Brexit, and to keep the coalition that shares that view together. But I will have more to say about that when we come to the end of the... I will, of course, give way to the right honourable.
Thank you very much. Does the right honourable gentleman believe that a matter of such importance, irrespective of the speed with which all this is being done, should really be dealt with ultimately in the context of a general election?
Well, there may well be a general election at some point, but this legislation, in my view, needs to be passed, needs to go through the other place, it needs to receive royal assent, and it needs to be given effect. In other words, we must, in my opinion, secure that extension to Article 50. Otherwise, there is a risk that the election would result in us leaving without a deal, which, as it may turn out at 7 o'clock tonight, is not what the House of Commons wants, and we should respect the view of the House of Commons. I will give way, yes.
I'm grateful for him giving way. If this bill does pass and it's given royal assent, can you think of any other reason why the Labour Party would not accept a general election?
I think I've just explained the reason. It's been made clear by the leader of the Labour Party, my right honourable friend, and the shadow Brexit secretary and others, because we must deal with first things first, and preventing a no-deal Brexit is the central, most important question facing the country.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for allowing me to intervene. I think he's answered my query. The reality is an election at this stage, or even next week, undermines the purpose of this legislation, and we can't support it.
Well, I can only agree, and I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for being one of the sponsors of the bill. I will take one more intervention at this stage because there are many people who want to speak. Time is short. Indeed.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman. And can I applaud his call for respect on all sides, because we just need to calm down this whole debate. I voted for the deal twice. He voted against the deal 3 times, presumably because he thought it was not in the best interests of this country. So how does he think this procedure of delaying any agreement yet further is going to produce an offer from the EU that might actually tempt him into voting something because it's even in the better interest of the UK than what has gone before? How can that possibly come about by this procedure?
Well, the reason why I voted against the deal 3 times was not to do with the withdrawal agreement, the legally binding treaty. It was to do with the nature of the political declaration and the absolute lack of clarity about where the then Prime Minister wanted to take the country. Now, that's my view, and other members have got different views. If I could bring us back, if honourable members will forgive me, I'm not going to give way further at this point. I have been reasonably generous, and I am conscious of the time. The evidence before us about the consequences of no deal, it's really important that we acknowledge that, because it is the fundamental reason behind the bill. As we heard from my right honourable friend, the member for Pontefract, Normanton and Castleford, when she moved her bill earlier this year, it was reported that the Cabinet Secretary and the National Security Advisor, Sir Mark Sedwill, had told the previous Cabinet that no deal would make our country less safe. Now, if the National Security Advisor says that to the Cabinet, we ought to pay attention. All of us have seen the government's own economic assessment that makes it clear that no deal would cause the greatest loss to the economy. We know that Make UK, for example, the body that represents British manufacturing industry, have described no deal as an act of economic vandalism. And since we last debated the question of an extension, new information has come to light about the consequences of no deal. The government itself has now admitted that there would be damage to companies. Why? Because they've said they're prepared to compensate certain businesses and industries, which is the first time in my experience the government has advocated a policy that they know will do economic damage. If I could just finish this point. And Operation Yellowhammer, the report that was published in the Sunday Times, talked about the potential for protests, for significant delays, for lorries at Dover and other ports, and we heard very powerful evidence on that subject only this morning in the Brexit Select Committee. A potential impact on medicines, decrease in the supply of fresh foods and some price rises, impact on petrol refineries, huge uncertainty for businesses, serious damage to farmers, and in some ways, given the progress that Northern Ireland has made in the last 20 years, most worrying of all, expressing the view that the current open border between Northern Ireland and the Republic could be unsustainable because of economic, legal and biosecurity risks. I will give way to to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and of course I'm keen to be supporting this bill today. He made the point about security. Is he aware that we repeatedly heard in the Home Affairs Committee evidence from senior police officers and security officials about the devastating impact of a no-deal Brexit? We keep hearing from the government all the time about bilateral security treaties. Well, they're not in place. We don't have those agreements to keep our borders safe from terrorists, criminals, paedophiles and others who would exploit our national security.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend completely. It's one of the many unanswered questions about what happens the other side of Halloween. And it's a point I shall come back to a little later on in my speech. I will give way.
For giving way. Can I just clarify one thing? Because members of his party have made comments in the media, and he, I think, said this earlier, that this bill stops no deal. Can we be clear that this bill does not stop no deal? It prolongs the date before we leave. And the likelihood is, unless something dramatically changes, we will be exactly at this point a few weeks before the new deadline. And the only way to stop no deal is to revoke Article 50. And if that is really what members of his side of the House want to happen, they should be honest with the British public.
Exactly. Well, I would say to the honourable gentleman that if someone says you can jump off a cliff with all of the damaging consequences in a couple of weeks' time, or we could put it off for 3 months, which would you like? I think the sensible course of action to take, given the damage that it would do to the country, is to put it off. I accept that we need ultimately to find a way forward. I have my own views, as have other members, about how that should be done, but that is not the purpose of this bill today, although it would provide for a framework within which the government can then decide what it's going to do. I give way, yes, indeed.
Thank the right honourable gentleman. 3 independent, highly respected bodies, the Health Foundation, the Nuffield Trust and the King's Fund, have written an open letter to all MPs setting out in very stark terms there would be significant damage to health and care services from a no deal, and more importantly, to people who depend on them, people that we're supposed to be here in this House to protect.
Well, I agree with the honourable lady, and I would simply say, and other members will have lots of other experience of the potential consequences, these are not risks that I think we should take with our economy, our businesses, our jobs, our livelihoods and our health. And I hope they remind everyone in the House today that for all the focus on process and motions and procedure, this is about the impact that a no-deal Brexit would have on the lives of the people we represent. I will, of course, give way.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. And isn't that the point, that while I can understand there is a political imperative to get this done, close quotes, to move on, close quotes, the practical imperative is that no deal doesn't allow us to move on. It resolves nothing. And it leads to many of the implications that he talked about. And if we have no withdrawal agreement on the 31st of October, what we have to do on the 1st of November is seek a withdrawal agreement.
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right. And in a lot of this debate, we haven't discussed anything like enough what happens the other side of the 31st of October if the Prime Minister is able to get his way. And I shall come to that point in a moment. I will give way.
For giving way, Chairman of the Brexit Select Committee. What his bill today does, and what he's doing is trying to prolong no damage till as far as the 31st of January, and make UK absolutely correct. Anything else but the current deal we've got will damage the economy. But the best way, and we've all got to get our heads around this, the best way to stop any damage at all is to revoke Article 50. I've laid an amendment to that end with a helpful letter to the schedule. It needs one signature, that of the Prime Minister. And this nightmare is over in that length of time.
Well, I disagree respectfully with the honourable gentleman, because I think just as no deal is unacceptable, in my opinion, I think revocation, which is basically saying let's cancel the whole result of the referendum, is not acceptable either. I've expressed previously in the House my view about how we should resolve this by going back to the people, but other members have different views. That is not the issue for today. I will give way to my honourable friend and then my other honourable friend, and then I am going to progress.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and if I may say, particularly grateful to the right honourable gentleman for the way in which he's chairing his Brexit Select Committee and taking this vital evidence. Isn't that really the point, over and above this bill? that this is precisely the sort of work that should be done. Questions should be laid in and asked of ministers. This place should be making sure that we are ready for any no deal. And yet what we're seeing is we're being closed down next week, when in fact we should be sitting, asking the questions, and his committee and others should be able to do their valuable work.
Well, the honourable member is absolutely right, because one of the consequences of prorogation is our select committees cannot meet, we cannot scrutinise the government, we cannot hold it to account. That is what we're essentially doing.
Does the honourable gentleman agree with me that it's surprising that there would appear to be those in this House who know more about making cars than those who make cars, more about building planes than those who build planes, more about engineering than the engineers, and that the simple truth is the overwhelming and unmistakable voice of the world of work, industry and all the employers' organisations and the trade unions is that a no-deal Brexit would have catastrophic consequences, with tens of thousands of workers losing their jobs, making our country a poorer country in every sense of the word for years to come.
My honourable friend makes a really powerful point. And I think those industries and those sectors, and we've all met them and heard their evidence, are troubled that the message that comes from their expertise and knowledge, they, after all, are the people creating the wealth of the country, is not being heard by a government that says we're prepared to leave with no deal on the 31st of October. Since my honourable friend is in the room next door to me, of course I will go away, and then I am going to make progress.
I'm grateful for the right honourable friend to giving way. I've actually received this morning a letter from the North East England Chamber of Commerce, in which they say over the last 3 years we've been clear and consistent, preserving the trading conditions and relationship we currently enjoy with the EU ought to be the primary objective of any Brexit outcome. Sadly, the government's willingness to embrace no deal as an acceptable end to the Brexit negotiations flies in the face of this. And they go on to say that it's a disastrous outcome for the North East of England. Doesn't these comments go to prove that his bill is an absolute necessity?
I think they absolutely do. And having now, in a sense, concluded a discussion and a reflection on the economic and other consequences of no deal, I want now to turn to what the bill actually does, because it intends to stop this happening by seeking an extension to Article 50 in certain very specific circumstances. It's very important to understand that the bill allows the Prime Minister the opportunity to reach a new agreement with the European Union at the European Council and to seek Parliament's consent to any such agreement. That is condition 1. It also allows the government to bring a motion to the House of Commons to seek our consent for leaving without a deal, for example, if discussions at the European Council prove unsuccessful. Now, I think the government would find it rather difficult to get such a motion through the House of Commons, but the bill allows them to seek to do that. Clause 1 specifically provides for both of those eventualities, and if either of those conditions is met, then there can be no further extension. If, however, neither of these conditions have been met by the 19th of October, chosen the day very deliberately, it is the day after the conclusion of the European Council, then the Prime Minister must ask the EU for a further extension until the 31st of January 2020 in the form of the letter set out in the schedule to the bill. Clause 3 deals with what happens next. If the European Council accedes to that request, then the Prime Minister must agree to it. If, however, the Council proposes an extension to a different date, then the Prime Minister must agree to that as well, unless the House of Commons decides not to pass a motion agreeing to it. That's what subsection 3 does. Now, it has been wrongly claimed in some commentary that the EU could propose an extension of any length, 6 months, 20 years, a millennium, and the Prime Minister would be required to accept it. Not so. In those circumstances, the House could decide. Furthermore, if a deal is reached after the Prime Minister has asked for an extension, then that would override any extension, so it also allows him if he can, to reach a deal after the European Council concludes on the 18th of October. In other words, I will give way, of course, to the right honourable gentleman in a moment. In other words, the bill gives the Prime Minister the flexibility that he wants and needs to get a deal, if he can. What it does not render further negotiation pointless. If the Prime Minister were here, I would say this forcefully to him. It seems to me what does is the Prime Minister's apparent refusal to put any proposals to the EU if this bill passes, which I can only describe as a very odd state of affairs. Of course I will give way to the right honourable gentleman, because clause 3.2 is very clear that the period of 2 days begins with the end of the day on which the European Council's decision is made. Decision is made. We were told very clearly during proceedings on the change of date after the 2 previous occasions that the government accepted an extension, that we were merely implementing a decision that was already made and binding in European Community law, European Union law. So what his proposal depends upon is the European Union making a conditional offer that is only comes into force if they choose to make it conditional on subsequent approval by the House of Commons. He has no way of binding the European Union's procedures by a domestic piece of legislation. The purpose of that is, if the bill is passed, the House of Commons will pass it in the knowledge that it is seeking, in the circumstances set out, for an extension to the 31st of January. If, however, the European Union proposes a different date, it seems to me only right and proper that the Prime Minister should be able to say either, yeah, that's fine by me, or I will need to go back and check. I agree with the right honourable gentleman that, of course, we cannot bind the European Union in the way which it seeks to work, but it's not at all unusual for member states to say, well, we will need to go back and check with our parliament, and I'm certain, given the importance of this issue, that the European Union would be able to find another procedure which might not involve the European Council meeting again to confirm the decision that it had made in making the offer in the first place. And the second point I would make is that 2 days is precisely to give the Prime Minister the chance to come back to the House. In those circumstances, I will give way.
Right honourable gentleman for giving way. My reading of this bill is it doesn't stop no deal. It postpones it potentially for 3 months. It doesn't stop it. But it does make it virtually impossible for our Prime Minister to negotiate, and is therefore actually a political bill, which is sadly some on our side have supported with. Because actually what it does is it tells the European Union that if they don't choose to negotiate and they don't choose to give us a better deal, but many of this bill is rejected, what they will instead get is the opportunity to offer us an extension of whatever they want for this House to take.
Well, I dealt with the last point, extension of whatever length, because there is a means of the government asking the House not to approve that, and then the House would have to decide in the light of what had been offered by the European Union. But I don't accept her central premise that this somehow undermines the Prime Minister's negotiating ability. If she just, I'm responding to her, if she'd just bear with me, because I don't myself regard the threat of a no-deal Brexit as part of a credible negotiating strategy, if the Honourable Lady would bear with me, because the previous Prime Minister spent, nearly 2 years saying no deal's better than a bad deal, and it didn't seem to work then, and I don't think it's going to work now. I will give way one more time.
Correct. If the European Union came back and offered us a 10-year extension, as the right honourable gentleman has suggested, then it would then be a choice for this House between a 10-year extension and the no deal he so wishes to avoid.
No, that is not the case. The House could decide to ask the Prime Minister to go back in those circumstances. The central point is that it gives the House of Commons in those circumstances the ability to express a view, but if the extension is to the 31st of January, we would have already decided that we were prepared to accept that. So only if he does not get a deal does the bill prevent the Prime Minister from taking us out of the EU without an agreement. Can I just... Well, I will give way one more time to the right honourable gentleman, because Article 53 of the Treaty on European Union boldly says that we leave on after 2 years, quotes, unless the European Council, in agreement with the member state concerned, unanimously decides to extend the period. Now, there is no obligation in that for the European Union to decide to make a conditional offer. They can decide, and yet the bill requires the Prime Minister, under those circumstances, to accept the terms that are on offer. That's it. So this is handing the decision not back to this House, but back to the European Union. I don't agree with that. And, of course, there is no guarantee with any of these provisions that a further request from the United Kingdom for another extension of Article 50 will be granted by the European Union. We all recognise that, because it only takes one member state of the European Union to say, no, I'm not giving the United Kingdom a further extension, for us to be in even greater difficulty than we are already. But what this is seeking to do is to require the Prime Minister to ask and then to agree to one, because this is what is required to prevent the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, from taking us out of the EU on the 31st of October without a deal. We didn't have to put those provisions in the earlier bill moved by my right honourable friend, the member for Pontefract, Normanton and Castleford, because the former Prime Minister readily accepted the decision of the House of Commons, but we are in different circumstances. Can I move on, Mr. Speaker, to what Clause 2 does? Because it covers what happens if an extension is proposed and agreed. Now, members have asked quite rightly, what is the extension for? The immediate answer is, of course, to avoid a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October, but Clause 2 does provide a framework in which the government must publish a report to the House on the 30th of November. It comes back to the point that my right honourable friend raised with me earlier, if the member would just bear with me, and move a motion to the effect that the House has approved the report. So that is a chance for the government to say, right, well, what are we going to do next? And it's also something that we can point to with the European Union, because, remember last time, Mr Tusk said, use the time well, and it's important that we as a House show we're not just saying, right, we want a further extension, then we're going to twiddle our thumbs for another 3 months. It is a process that is being suggested here in the bill. If the report is amended or rejected, there must be further reports from the government, and again on the 10th of January, and then every 28 days thereafter, until an agreement is either reached with the EU or otherwise indicated by resolution of the House. And I think the framework that is in Clause 2 of the bill will help answer the question about what we intend to do with the additional time, and that will be a matter for Parliament. I will give way to my honourable.
Surely one of the things that we want to do during that time is try to find a solution to the Irish question. Is he aware that the EU Commission Task Force is reporting that the PM is reneging on his commitment to protect the all-island economy and meaningful north-south cooperation? So clearly the time should be used to ensure there is decent cooperation.
I have those reports, Mr. Speaker, and they concern me, as I know they will concern the honourable gentleman and many other people in the House. So the aim of this clause is not, I think the Leader of the House suggested yesterday, to create a marionette government, but I would argue to give the government the time it needs to do its job. And I say that because it's not clear what is happening at the moment, as we discussed yesterday, how much negotiation is actually taking place when no proposals have been made. Now, and it's really very hard to understand that, since I would have thought the government was working flat out since July. Now, even if agreement was reached, I think it's also important to make the point that it's very hard to see how you could then get the House's approval and pass all the legislation between the 18th of October or so and the 31st. Now, the final point, Mr. Speaker, I want to make is this. What would happen if we left with no deal? The Prime Minister talks about getting it done and ending the uncertainty. But the truth is, and the honourable member made the point so powerfully, no deal does not end anything. It would simply plunge us into greater uncertainty of all. Uncertainty, no, I'm going to bring my remarks to a close. Uncertainty about the degree and length of disruption, uncertainty about the border arrangements in Northern Ireland, uncertainty about what our future relationship trading relationship would be with our biggest, nearest and most important trading partners, the other members of the European Union. And given that it's taken 3 years to get this far, in other words, not very far at all, and given that it took Canada 7 years to negotiate a deal, and the Prime Minister says he wants a super Canada deal, it's going to take years to agree a new relationship. And every single EU member state and every single EU member state parliament and regional parliament will have to agree to any deal. No deal will not be the end of Brexit. It will only be the end of the beginning. And in that time, faced with the degree of uncertainty, businesses are going to have countless decisions to make about where to invest, what to make, and where, and what to do about the sudden disappearance of all the arrangements that they have come to know and work within, and the sudden imposition of tariffs. Mr. Speaker, it would be utterly irresponsible to allow this to happen. We have a duty to prevent it, and I hope the House will vote for this bill tonight.
Order. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. In an attempt to accommodate lots of members who wish to take part, I'm obliged to impose a 5-minute limit on backbench speeches with immediate effect. Mr. Alistair Burt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak as the proud but slightly bemused independent member for North East Bedfordshire. Let me make, if I may, just 3 brief points in support of the bill, and to commend my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, for his remarks and the way he went through the technicalities. I've no wish to do the same and don't wish to detain the House in relation to that. Just 3 points briefly. Is the bill a stumbling block to negotiations? No, it's not. The bill does not, in my view, prevent the Prime Minister or the government from negotiating, for the reason that we don't yet have a deal, or might not get one, is not this bill. Ever since the referendum and the start of negotiations, a variety of reasons have been cited for not getting a deal. In no particular order, it's been a Remainer Parliament, a Remainer Prime Minister, Ollie Robbins, the EU, Michel Barnier, Martin Selmayr, always a different reason. We were told recently all could be solved if only we elected a Prime Minister who was a Brexiteer, with an absolute determination to leave, no questions asked. Then the EU would fold, and we would have the deal the UK always wanted. We have such a Prime Minister whose determination is clear. The EU has not folded. So we're told this time, it's us, it's me. This is nonsense. There's 2 reasons we haven't had a deal. Firstly, members in this House have not voted for a deal, which if they looked at it hard, they would have bitten the hand off people 2 years ago to accept all the provisions in the withdrawal agreement, and a transition period that a Brexiteer will now be in charge of. And the second reason is that many in the UK have failed to grasp it was we who left the EU. And that means that it's a negotiation between us, and we've never really understood the EU or its arguments and believed a negotiation was a series of demands from the United Kingdom, not a negotiation. That and the language that we have used, built on 20-odd years of drip of poison about the EU, has made sure that we didn't get a deal. Very briefly, if I may.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way on that point, and we both came in the House in the same year, and I'm sad to see his announcement that he's going. Does he agree with me that the kind of language that is being used from the front bench and in the media about those who are trying to prevent no deal, traitors, collaborators, all of that war-like language is less than helpful?
Absolutely. I shall come in my conclusion to talk a little bit about that and how we've got to reset, but my right honourable friend makes a good point. And secondly, why do we want to avoid no deal? I won't repeat all the things that my right honourable friend said that are obvious, and the economics are clear, but for me there's 3 things. Firstly, the threat to the Union. I'm a Scot. My mother and father from Scotland. I'm a proud Scot. I'm British through and through. I couldn't believe a poll of Conservative members recently that said they'd abandon almost anything, including the Union, providing they left the EU. I regard that as a terrible threat. We should not risk it. Secondly, Ireland. Ireland treated by some here as some sort of irrelevance, a place to where they have made up the border issue in order to prevent us leaving the EU. with our history in relation to Ireland, everything that happened there, they became our best friends in the European Union. Yes. And our choice to leave, our Brexit, has put them in the most catastrophic situation of any country, and we now expect them to accept another English demand that they should do something. Have we no understanding of what that relationship means and the damage done? And thirdly, the damage to Europe and the relationship with Europe itself. I grew up as the first generation to avoid war in Europe for countless hundreds of years. I arrived in the House of Commons when there were giants. Dennis Healey, Willie Whitelaw, Ted Heath, people for whom Europe was the place where they and their friends had fought and died, and they wanted something different. And that has always motivated me in my sense of Europe. And whether we are in the European Union or not, that relationship with Europe is clouded by the sort of language that the Right Honourable Lady has mentioned. I don't want to see that threatened by a no deal. And lastly,
his second intervention.
just a moment. I've listened to the Right Honourable Gentleman involuntarily for most of the years I've been here. Most, not all, because I went to campaign for him in his by-election, I think, of 1984. I've no wish to hear from him voluntarily. Let me go on. Thirdly, and in conclusion, let me end where I began, as the independent member for North East Bedfordshire. I don't complain at the removal of the whip. Voting on an issue of confidence, I accept the rules. But to my colleagues here, just think of how this looks. This morning, the Conservative Party lost Ruth Davison last week. George Young in the House of Lords resigned as the whip. And my right honourable friends from Rushcliffe, from Runnymede and Weybridge, who made the economy we were cheering just a few minutes ago. What are people going to think about what we have left and what we have lost? Some will have been very happy at the fact that some have been purged. A few weeks ago, one of our colleagues retweeted an article in the Daily Telegraph that looked forward to the purging of Remonas in the Conservative Party. That was disgraceful. And I say to my colleagues, if we are being purged now, who's next? Yeah! Who's next? Watch a film called Good Night and Good Luck, and you'll take my point. This may be the last substantive speech I make here, as I'm not standing again, and who knows when the election will come. I will leave with the best of memories of this place, of friends and colleagues on all sides. The obsession of my party has developed may have sought to devalue my past as a friend of the EU, of our sister centre-right parties of many friends, and it may have curtailed my future, but it will not rob me of what I believe, and I will walk out of here looking up at the sky, not down at my shoes.
Order. Thank you. Order. Colleagues, Maiden speech, Jane Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to be speaking in this particular debate. May I start firstly by paying tribute to my predecessor, Mr. Chris Davis. He worked hard for our local communities, raising awareness on the very difficult issue of mental health and suicide in farmers. I thank him for his service. Chris followed hard on the heels of the highly respected Liberal Democrat MP Roger Williams. Roger's are large boots to fill, and if I can even partially match his passion, service and commitment, I shall be very pleased. It is a huge pleasure to represent Brecon and Radnorshire, one of the most beautiful constituencies in the country. It's also the largest constituency in England and Wales, something that I'm sure some members here will have discovered during the recent by-election when searching for yet another elusive farmhouse up yet another long and scenic track. Brecon and Radnorshire is home to strong and resilient communities, some of which are Welsh-speaking. Sadly, many of our libraries, banks and post offices in these communities have closed in recent years. But despite this, there is a real joy for life in the old counties of Radnorshire and Brecknockshire, as well as healthy rivalry between them, that make sure the Mid-Wales spirit, yr ysbryd, is alive and well. Many members here will have had the luxury of making their maiden speeches in the weeks and months following a general election, looking forward to many years of a full parliamentary term. Mine couldn't be in more different circumstances. On the night of the by-election, I promised the people of Brecon and Radnorshire that I would tell the Prime Minister exactly why a no-deal Brexit would be damaging for my constituents. Well, I am delighted that my very first vote as the Member of Parliament for Brecon and Radnorshire last night was to help Parliament take back control of the agenda and do everything possible to prevent us leaving the EU without a deal, including speaking in this debate today. When it comes to a no-deal Brexit, we need to stop talking in terms of the hypothetical and the theoretical, and we need to start talking with candour about the real and damaging consequences it would bring. A no-deal Brexit would be damaging for everyone in my constituency, but particularly for the people who are the lifeblood of Brecon and Radnorshire, the farmers. Welsh farmers, as we heard this morning, export 40% of their lamb, and over 90% of that goes to the EU. Currently, if farmers in Brecon and Radnorshire export to the EU, export tariffs are, well, let me have a think, they are 0. A no-deal Brexit would mean 40% of tariffs go on Welsh lamb exports. This would risk putting farmers in my constituency and right across Wales out of business. I will be using my votes today to ensure that a no-deal Brexit is avoided, as it would be catastrophic for the people of Brecon and Radnorshire. Whether people voted Remain or Leave, they did not vote for a no-deal Brexit that would make them poorer. They did not vote for long waits for life-saving medicines, and they did not vote for a decline in our country's environmental standards. Mr. Speaker, I'm extremely privileged to be able to serve the wonderful people of Brecon and Radnorshire, and I shall do my utmost to be an MP that they are proud of. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think the House greatly enjoyed listening to the Honourable Lady, and we wish her well. Mr. Philip Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want us to leave the European Union with a deal, and I've voted 3 times to leave the European Union with a deal. And I regret the fact that it has become necessary for this bill to be brought forward now. And it is necessary now for 2 reasons. Firstly, because Parliament stands prorogued, so we will not have time potentially to bring Parliament back after my right honourable friend the Prime Minister has had the 30 days that he asked for to see whether he has been successful in getting a deal. And secondly, because members of the government have speculated openly that the government may not comply with legislation even if it has passed, and we therefore need to allow time not merely for legislation but for litigation as well. And because I'll give way to the honourable member just once.
Just on that point, we've heard noises to that effect from certain members of the government and government sources. Would the right honourable member agree that if this bill is passed, it is very important the Prime Minister adheres to its terms, because it is a fundamental duty of a government to uphold the rule of law?
I absolutely agree, Mr. Speaker, but I think we've heard very clearly that we cannot rule out the possibility that the government will dispute the interpretation of the bill and that there will be a need for litigation in the courts to ensure that its effect is delivered. Mr. Speaker, we need to act because there is no mandate for a no-deal Brexit, and a no-deal Brexit will be a catastrophe for the United Kingdom. And I remind my honourable and right honourable friends on the front bench that many of us now on the back benches have had the privilege of seeing the detailed analysis from within government about the precise and damaging effects of such a no-deal Brexit. And we need to act for another reason, because my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, repeats two statements. He says that he is sincerely trying to get a deal, and he says that we will leave on October the 31st, come what may, do or die. And regrettably, those two statements are incompatible. Because even if the fantasy deal that the Prime Minister sets out, where the EU concedes to every demand of the United Kingdom, removes every one of its red lines, were agreed tomorrow, it would still not be possible to get through all the stages of process required, including passage through both houses of this Parliament by the 31st of October. So we had to act. The Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central has set out brilliantly the purposes of the bill and how it works. Time is limited, so I don't intend to rehearse those arguments. I want simply to focus on two claims that are made against Conservative supporters of this bill, or former Conservative supporters of this bill, by the government, and seek to rebut them. Presumably these claims have been made as a justification for the mass purge that occurred last night. The first claim is that by removing the threat of no deal on the 31st of October, we are cutting the legs from under the government in its negotiations with the EU. That is wrong. It's wrong because actually there is no negotiation going on with the EU. We've had confirmation from multiple sources across the European Union that nothing is happening, confirmation from within government that nothing is happening, and the government has declined to bring forward any proposals or serve on the European Union any proposals. And it betrays a deep misunderstanding of the way European politics works. Yes, European politics is every bit as scrappy as British politics, but across the continent of Europe, people who are sworn enemies, who debate vigorously, are used to having to make deals, because for the overwhelming majority of our colleagues in Europe, coalition government is the norm. They have a different system from our adversarial system. And so the EU has taken a remarkably consistent approach throughout these negotiations, on the format of the negotiations, on their mandate, on their commitment to transparency. They publish everything openly. Nothing that we are doing here is going to undermine the Prime Minister's ability to negotiate with the European Union. The thing that will undermine it is his unwillingness to pursue a realistic negotiating objective. If he tried to achieve significant changes to the way the backstop works, that would be a major concession by the European Union. But I do think my right honourable friend, as a new Prime Minister leading a new government, would stand at least a reasonable chance of getting a hearing and maybe succeeding. But by setting the bar as he has at the total removal of the backstop, he has set the bar at a level which is impossible for the European Union to comply with. The second claim that is made against us is that by supporting this bill, we are handing power to the Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, I would sooner boil my head than hand power to the Leader of the Opposition. But the purpose of this bill, most of us will have no truck with the concept of a vote of no confidence. The purpose of this bill is to instruct this government and this administration how to conduct the UK's future arrangements with the European Union. It is not an attempt to remove this government. It is certainly not an attempt to hand power to the Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, it's not us who are heightening the risk of a government led by the Leader of the Opposition. It is my right honourable friend, by pursuing a course of action which, if unchallenged, can only lead to a no-deal Brexit.
Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill. The Prime Minister has decided that the UK should leave the EU on the 31st of October with or without a deal. He says that he's making progress in talks with a view to getting a deal, but he's not. Chancellor Merkel says no proposals have been put forward by the government. The Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland says no proposals have been put forward by the government across the EU. Everybody says no proposals have been put forward by the government. And yesterday the government didn't deny that they haven't put proposals forward in these negotiations. They just dodged questions and refused to answer honest questions as to whether there's any evidence of any progress in the talks. They are convincing no one, and at Prime Minister's questions today, the Prime Minister tied himself completely in knots, suggesting that he hadn't put forward any proposals because this bill might pass later this week. So for the last 6 weeks, he hasn't done anything in case a bill he hadn't heard of gets royal assent sometime soon. Ridiculous. So there's no progress. There's no workable alternative on the table to prevent a hard border in Northern Ireland. Indeed, a point already touched on. Far from making progress on this crucial point, it's reported yesterday that the government is seeking to backtrack and revisit the commitments to protect the all-Ireland economy, including the December 27 joint report.
Speaker, I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way. My wife comes from County Armagh, and I was married some 2 miles from the border during the height of the Troubles. Is it not arguable that the present border arrangements in the island of Ireland contribute massively to the present peace process which we enjoy?
Absolutely. Massive. They are the manifestation of peace in Northern Ireland. And I've said many times, it is more than a question of getting goods and people across a line. It is the manifestation of peace that allows different communities to live together in peace. So, I will, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm enormously grateful to the Right Honourable and learned gentleman for allowing me to intervene with him. Would the Right Honourable gentleman agree with me that it is very strange, to put it mildly, that bearing in mind that the Republic of Ireland is our nearest EU neighbour and shares a land frontier with part of the United Kingdom, with Northern Ireland, and is also a co-guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement, that the Prime Minister has been so busy negotiating over the summer, as he claims, that he hasn't actually found time to go to Dublin to meet the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, and discuss any proposals that he might have. Is that not extraordinary?
Yes, it is extraordinary, but it sits with the other evidence that there aren't any proposals being put forward and that there aren't any negotiations actually taking place. And therefore, we're not closer to a deal now than we were when this Prime Minister took office. In truth, we're further away. Mr. Speaker, for the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, that appears from leaks to be his policy position, because he talks of negotiations apparently for domestic consumption, and the talks are a sham. I will give way.
Would he reassure me that we will not fall into the trap being set by the Prime Minister, and we will not support a general election before not only this bill is enacted, but its provisions, including an extension, have been implemented?
We will not. I can confirm we will not be voting with the government tonight, and we will keep our focus on the task in hand, which is to ensure that we do not leave the EU without a deal, and that requires the passing and implementation of this Act. So, I'll just make some progress and then I'll give way in just a moment. So, Mr. Speaker, the truth is we're on course for a no-deal Brexit, for which there is no mandate from the public or from this Parliament. Now, you might think in those circumstances that this Parliament would be sitting every available day between now and the 31st of October to avert this threat, to scrutinise the Prime Minister's plan, if there is one, and to find a way forward if we can. And we would all willingly sit those days to find that way forward. But no, from next week, the Prime Minister wants to shut this place down for 5 weeks in this crucial period. And he thinks that we and the public are going to be fooled by the obvious untruth that prorogation is merely for a Queen's speech. The 5 weeks prorogation is to silence this House, it is to frustrate attempts to prevent a no deal, and any suggestion to the contrary from anyone, in my view, is disingenuous. I will give way.
Right Honourable Friend for giving way. Does he agree with me that the characterisation of Conservative Central Office, which even now is appearing on Twitter and in their other social media as we debate this extremely important bill, hashtagging this bill the surrender bill, is beneath contempt?
It is beneath contempt, and I can only imagine the businesses, the people who work in businesses and the management of businesses who will look in on horror, because they have repeatedly told me and many other members of this House their deep concerns about no deal, and we are protecting this country against no deal. I'm going to make some progress and then I will give way. Mr. Speaker, in the circumstances where there's no progress in the negotiations, we're hurtling towards no deal, and the Prime Minister is closing down this place, we have no alternative but to pursue this bill. We have to act with urgency and to pass binding legislation to rule out no deal by the time this House prorogues. That is what this bill will achieve today. And I want to thank and put on record my thanks for the honourable and right honourable members who've worked over many weeks on this bill. In particular, the right honourable member for West Dorset, the right honourable and learned member for Beaconsfield, the right honourable member for Leeds Central, and the right honourable member for Runnymede and Weybridge, but also the leaders of the SNP, the Lib Dems, Greens, Plaid and Change UK, because this has genuinely been a cross-party bill. And can I, on behalf of all my colleagues, acknowledge the courage of the 21 former Conservative MPs who voted as a matter of principle on Standing Order 24 last night, putting their country before their careers. We acknowledge their courage and what they did as a matter of principle. Why has there been Why has there been such concerted effort? It's not usual to find this alliance of all opposition parties and cross-party MPs. The answer is because we all appreciate the appalling damage no deal would cause to jobs, to industry, to our NHS, to security and to peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland. And therefore, we were all shocked, if not surprised, at the warnings contained in the leaked Yellowhammer documents. Food and fuel shortages, delay to medicines, chaos at ports and channel crossings, and affecting the poorest communities of all. But what leapt out to me, Mr. Speaker, from the Yellowhammer documents was the honest advice to the government that, try as they might, the civil servants could not find a way of avoiding the conclusion that if we leave without a deal, there will have to be infrastructure in Northern Ireland. I will give way.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. And isn't it ironic that on the very week the government announces it will do an advertising campaign that's called Get Ready for Brexit, it simultaneously refuses to actually release any details about what we're meant to be getting ready for?
We'll be here to discuss
and wouldn't ministers be better advised to simply be transparent about the impact of no deal and, frankly, about the fact it sounds to me like there was never a detailed plan on how to deliver Brexit. There hasn't been in 3 years, and I really worry that it never existed in the first place.
Of course, that information should be put in the public domain so that everybody understands the impact of no deal, and the fact that the government doesn't want it in the public domain speaks volumes. But also this mantra that we can't put our proposals in public because you don't negotiate in public. You can surely put them before the partners that you're actually supposed to be negotiating with, and they just are not there. So, Mr. Speaker, I will give way.
There are lots of people wanting to speak. There's very little time, and if there are continual interventions, very large numbers of colleagues who wish to speak won't do so. Simple as that. Jonathan Edwards.
Grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. On Yellowhammer, the Welsh Government has been provided with a copy of the original document. Will he call on his colleagues to publish it?
Well, I will, but I'm not sure that me calling is enough in itself to get them published. But we'll see what else we can do. Mr. Speaker, I will press on because I do know there are other speakers. This is actually a very simple bill. it is deliberately constrained. It doesn't answer the question what else needs to happen, but it does, and it gives the Prime Minister the chance to get a deal and to get it through. It gives the Prime Minister the chance to have the courage to come to this dispatch box and say, my policy is to leave without a deal. Do I have a majority for it? Because if he did that, we wouldn't need to go down this route. But he won't do it because he knows the results. And it only if there's no deal, and only if there's no approval for leaving without a deal, do the provisions in the Act, in the bill, kick in, requiring an extension. Mr. Speaker, this is an extraordinary route, but these are extraordinary times. We have to act. We have to act now. Today is the last chance to prevent no deal, and we must seize it. Thank you.
Well, colleagues, but with immediate effect, we now need a 3-minute time limit. Otherwise, colleagues who want to speak will not have the chance to do so. Mr. Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And perhaps I can start by agreeing with what something others have said, which is, regardless of your views on this subject, the Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central, my Right Honourable friend for North East Bedfordshire, and others who've spoken in this debate are acting in the national interest in bringing up these issues in the way that they do. They don't deserve to be name-called as a result. But can I'm afraid, having said all of that, disagree with the bill that the Right Honourable Gentleman has put forward. It does 3 things. It sets out that the government should get specific parliamentary authority for any deal that it negotiates. It sets out that it should get specific authority for any exit from the EU without a deal. And it sets out that, failing either of those, it should enact a 3-month further extension in our departure from the EU. I'm afraid my view is that the first 2 of those are unnecessary and the third is undesirable. And in 2.5 minutes, I'll try and explain why. On the first, it seems to me that our existing procedures allow for the government to bring forward any deal that it negotiates and for us to approve it or not. It would be an international treaty and the processes are already in place for us to do that. Secondly, in relation to a no-deal outcome, what the Right Honourable Gentleman and colleagues have put forward is on the premise that there is no mandate for no deal. It is certainly true that the Leave campaign in the 2016 referendum did not advocate for no deal. It wasn't their preference, and as I understand it, it isn't the government's preference still. But neither was it put to the electorate, that we would only leave if there was a deal with the EU. And that could never have been guaranteed. There was no pattern to follow, no example for us to look at, and it could never have been certain that the EU would put forward a proposal that we found acceptable. Indeed, some of us, Mr. Speaker, who argued for Remain in that referendum campaign, said that if you decide to leave, you take a leap in the dark. You cannot know what the future will look like. You cannot know what, if any, deal we are offered by the EU or by anyone else. And the electorate, as it was their absolute right to do, listened to those arguments, rejected them, and decided to leave anyway. It was their decision to make, and in my view, they were perfectly entitled to make it. I'll give way just once.
I thank my Right Honourable friend for giving way. Even if I accepted his main point about the way that the referendum campaign was conducted by Leave, which I don't, does he not accept that in a democracy, minorities have rights? A minority as big as 48%, which was a majority in Northern Ireland, which was a majority in Scotland and in our northern cities, should not be so dismissed.
I certainly agree with my honourable friend that minorities should not be dismissed, and frankly the way in which we conduct this debate should reflect the fact that 48% of the public voted in a different way to the prevailing outcome. I don't think, frankly, we have succeeded in that as a parliament or as a broader national debate. But the truth of it is that we, Parliament, set out the rules for this referendum in the 2015 Referendum Act. As my honourable friend has just said, many of us participated in that referendum campaign on both sides of the argument, where again we stressed it was the public's decision to make. And when they had made it, we, Parliament, decided to enact and trigger Article 50 of the EU Treaty. And, Mr. Speaker, as someone who spent more time than is good for anyone looking at Article 50, I can tell you in the House it doesn't require the leaving country to do so with a deal. And when we, Parliament, decided to trigger that Article 50 process, we knew, or we should have known, that one possible outcome of it was a no-deal outcome. Not one we wished to see, not one we expected to see, but one that could have happened. So I'm afraid that on this fundamental point in the Right Honourable Gentleman's bill, I cannot agree that we do not have a mandate for no deal, and therefore we must proceed as the Right Honourable Gentleman has set out.
Lisa Nandy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome this bill, and can I say also that I very much welcome the tone with which my honourable friend introduced it. It reminded me of that famous book, Profiles in Courage, by John F. Kennedy, when he said there are few, if any, issues where all the truth and all the right and all the angels are on one side. And I think we would do well to remember that in this House. There are coherent, persuasive and passionate arguments and points that have been made by people with every single type of view on Brexit, and we ought to respect one another and conduct the debate in that spirit. This is not an easy thing for me to vote for, because I've spent the last few years arguing passionately that delay has consequences, that companies in my constituency need certainty, and that the public can't take much more of this. They want to see us come together, they want to see us compromise, they want to see us respect the 48% of people who came out and said they wanted close ties with the EU, and they want to see, I won't for time I'm afraid, and they want to see us also respect the fact that 52% of those who voted to leave the EU. We said it was their choice, and we have a duty to try and enact it. But the truth is that this is the right thing to do. There are people in my constituency, very many of them, a third of whom voted Remain, who now want to see us just stop this process altogether. And there are a number of people now, I would say the most significant group, who want to cut all ties and leave the EU altogether. They shout louder than the others, and they often drown out those voices calling for consensus. But it is my job to make sure that they don't, because they do not have the right to put food manufacturing companies in my constituency out of business. We lived through the closure of the mines in Wigan, and we live with those consequences still today. It was a tragedy for many families from which some never ever recovered. I will not let those small and medium employers in my constituency, who make up the bulk of employment, be put out of business because we cannot get our act together as a House, because we cannot stop this reckless Prime Minister, because we cannot then work together to achieve the deal that we have promised the people that we will get. They do not have the right to say to the child in my constituency who is waiting for a potentially life-saving clinical trial, you will not get it. They do not have the right to keep mums who stopped me, a mum who stopped me at the train station to say she was stockpiling medicine. They do not have the right to keep her up at night because she doesn't know if her child will survive. And that is why I say that this matters. We have finally in this House, after years of saying that no deal was a hoax, that it was a bluff, that it wouldn't happen, we've woken up to the reality of it. Now we have to make sure it doesn't happen, and we have to go out and we have to win this argument with the public. And as my honourable friend so rightly and eloquently said, so we can walk out of here looking at the sky and not at our shoes.
Thank you. Sir Nicholas Soames.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support this bill, but before I do so, I want to make clear that I have always believed that the referendum result must be honoured, and indeed I voted for the withdrawal agreement on every occasion it has been presented to the House, which is more than can be said for my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, the Leader of the House and other members of the Cabinet, whose serial disloyalty has been such an inspiration to so many of us. Mr. Speaker, I think history will, in due course, favour the view articulated so clearly last night by my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, that a threat to commit an act of self-harm if your counterparts in a negotiation do not do exactly as you wish is not exactly likely to be an effective or successful negotiating strategy. Mr. Speaker, the bill before the House today is modest in its ambitions, but powerful in its mandate. It merely seeks to avert the immediate risks of the disaster of a no-Brexit exit on the 31st of October, and it thereby seeks to give the Government and this House a further opportunity to achieve a resolution of this profoundly difficult issue. Mr. Speaker, contrary to the Prime Minister's assertion, it does not deprive him of the ability or the flexibility to achieve a negotiated settlement with the European Union on the 17th of October. But it does ensure that if he should fail, as with his current demands I think he is also likely to do so, then there will be time for him to rethink his remarks. Mr. Speaker, I am not standing at the next election, and I am thus...
Will my right honourable friend accept from me what I think is a view shared not just on these benches but across the House, that that will be a great loss to our party?
I'm very, very grateful to my right honourable friend, for whom I have such high regard. Mr. Speaker, I am not standing at the next election, and I am thus approaching the end of 37 years' service to this House, of which I have been proud and honoured beyond words to be a member. I am truly very sad that it should end in this way, and it is my most fervent hope that this House will rediscover the spirit of compromise, humility and understanding that will enable us finally to push ahead with the vital work in the interests of the whole country that has inevitably had to be so sadly neglected whilst we have devoted so much time to wrestling with Brexit. I urge the House to support this bill.
Mr. Stephen Giffins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the member for Brecon and Radnor for her maiden speech? I warn her that it may not look like it or feel like it, but in normal parliamentary times I would still be in my first term, and there are a number of twists and turns that we've seen and that she should continue to expect. Mr. Speaker, as the member for Mid Sussex just illustrated so eloquently, there are very few positives to be taken out of this process. But one of the few positives have been the way that those of us who disagree vociferously on many issues are able to cross party lines and reach out. And I thank him for his speech and for his service, as well as I do with other colleagues I've had the privilege to be able to make with. And I'll give way once, Mr. Speaker, to the honourable member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable gentleman for allowing me to intervene briefly. He just paid tribute to the work of cross-party to secure, hopefully, this bill this evening. Would he agree with me that it is crucial, and I know that the honourable gentleman for Plaid, who is also part of our coalition, has made plain his view, that it is crucial that we not only secure this legislation in law, but we secure the implementation of this legislation before any election is called or held, that we do not allow the possibility of a re-elected Johnson government to then reintroduce a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October.
And as usual, the honourable member, who's been a good colleague to me, makes an excellent point on that. In a parliament of minorities, we must work together. And look, we want a general election, but we will not have a general election on the terms of this government because we don't trust them. None of us can trust them, and we should be absolutely clear on this. Now, over the past few years, and I say this personally, it's been humbling often to see people give up careers and livelihoods for what they think is right, and we have seen the best of that over the past few days. Because there are members opposite and members on these benches who may not have started on these benches, who know that a no-deal Brexit will damage their constituents. Now, I never thought I would be here proposing a bill with the likes of the MP for Putney, Grantham and Stratford, Runnymede and Weybridge. To be fair to them, I don't think they thought they'd be in the position whereby they'd be proposing a bill that might go through with a member of the Scottish National Party either. But that's the situation we have been left in. This bill doesn't go as far as I might have liked. Like my colleagues in the SNP, we do not want to see Scotland taken out of the European Union against its will. We'd want to stop Brexit. But I know that others who have signed this bill, who are voting for this bill, want to deliver Brexit. We disagree on that, and that's fine. but we agree fundamentally that a no-deal Brexit is unacceptable and has to be stopped at all costs. And this legislation is important. And I'm sorry, but we have a government that cannot be trusted, that's tried every trick in the book to avoid scrutiny and democracy. Can you imagine, over the weekend, we were in a situation whereby people could ask the legitimate question to the government over whether or not they respect the rule of law? And I hope members reflect on that over the coming days. But this unfortunately goes to the heart of the Prime Minister's approach. The least trustworthy resident of number 10 Downing Street anybody can remember. It is a mess of his making is why we're in the situation just now. He had no plans before the referendum and he has no plans now. There's nothing new in the negotiations, and the ministers have told us nothing new in the negotiations. Instead, we have a government perfectly willing to let the rest of the population endure food price increases when too many depend on food banks already, medical shortages that will hit the needy and most vulnerable, damage to public services already hit by a decade of austerity, depriving our young people of education and employment opportunities that my generation enjoyed and benefited from. All of us, all of these people, we in Parliament should be doing our utmost to support and protect. That's a basic of our democracy. This slash-and-burn approach to politics will damage everybody across these islands and Europe for decades, but most of all people within the United Kingdom. We can stop this now, and we can do so with legislation, and we owe it to the most vulnerable and those who will be worst affected. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Sir William Cash.
Speaker, I just briefly refer to the remarks made by the honourable member for Bedford. I just simply wanted to explain very simply that I was going to intervene because he was referring to the sacrifice that people had made in the last war. I just want to put it on record. My father was killed in the last war. I think I understand not only the issues involved in that, but also the fact that he fought for freedom, and I believe that that is our heritage, and that is what we should fight for, not to be governed by other people. I just leave that on the record. I happen to also very much agree with my right honourable friend, the member for Kenilworth, in what is actually an extremely rare occasion when somebody has actually explained, as I have on my own a number of times, that there is nothing in this arrangement that we've been foisted with that would prevent us from leaving without a deal. We can do so if we wish to do so, and there's nothing that was in the Referendum Act or in the question in the Act which constrains us from that course of action. But fundamentally, I just simply want to make this one point, Mr. Speaker, and that is this. I wouldn't call this the European Union Withdrawal Bill. I would call it the European Union Subservience Bill. And I will say that very simply. You only have to look at the words in the bill, and in the very short time that I have available, I would simply say this. If you look at section 1, the words, the Prime Minister must seek to obtain from the European Council an extension of the period of time. Under clause 3, if the European Council agrees to agree an extension, the Prime Minister must, immediately after such a decision be made, notify the President of the Council the European Kingdom agrees to the proposed extension, and so on. And then, in regard to clause 4, it says, in relation to the Withdrawal Act of 2018, where regulations are to be made, it says that the definition of exit day for may substitute must. This is a disgraceful, in my opinion, a disgraceful reversal of our constitutional arrangements. We operate in a free parliament where we have elections which are taken periodically every 5 years as a normal rule. And we make our decisions. We have a system of parliamentary government, not government by parliament. And that is a fundamental constitutional principle. And this bill offends that principle, and that is why I'm deeply opposed to its proposals.
Jane Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I strongly support the bill before the House, and I have long believed that a no-deal Brexit would be disastrous. Resolving this issue and stopping our country crashing out of the EU is of the utmost urgency, as I believe the Prime Minister wants a no deal. All the actions of the current Prime Minister would support that view and everything he's said since becoming Prime Minister. He is sending our country hurtling towards no deal, and this is a prospect that nobody voted for or campaigned for in 2016. It is simply wrong to be playing with people's lives and their jobs and their businesses and their well-being in this way. At Brimsdown in Enfield, we have the second largest industrial estate in London. It's a vital part of our local economy, with 8,000 people employed in 240 companies on site. Many of these companies trade throughout the EU, and if we crash out with no deal and these companies get hit by tariffs on their exports, then Brimsdown and Enfield will suffer. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster yesterday promised to help firms hit by no-deal tariffs, but he gave no fulsome details on how this would work in practice. Neither is he willing to publish estimates of the impact no-deal tariffs could have on various sectors. How much financial support would be made available to companies? How long would that support last for? Which businesses would and would not be covered by government subsidy? So many questions and never any answers. In Enfield also, we have very high levels of deprivation that are growing apace. We have near 40,000 children living on or below the poverty line. But a no-deal Brexit, nor a general election, this is not going to stop this nightmare we face here, and it is going to exacerbate exponentially the problems my constituents are facing. We hear much about the technicalities of all of this every time it's debated, and particularly today. Those who want a no-deal Brexit, or any kind of Brexit at any price, want to talk all the time about technicalities. I want to see members of this House take real responsibility for the impact a no-deal Brexit would have on our constituents, and particularly the most vulnerable of them. It is an abrogation of our responsibility as their representatives to go down this road. And let's be clear, a no deal will just be the start. I believe that the only way out of this mess is in fact to go back to the people with a people's vote on Brexit. But at the very least, we must take the catastrophe of no deal off the table now. I urge all members to support this bill today.
Sandbach. Mr. Speaker, and I want to put on record what a pleasure it has been to serve my constituents in Eddisbury, and I think they'd be amazed to know that the purge of the Conservative Party that took place yesterday led to their Member of Parliament being expelled from the party, together with 8 Privy Councillors, 2 former Chancellors, a former Lord Chancellor, and the member for Rushcliffe, who has been a political inspiration for me for years. The economic arguments are well known, but in my constituency, where the chemicals, car industry, pharmaceuticals industry, aerospace industry, nuclear industry and food and drink sectors are all key sectors in the North West, 80,000 jobs are at risk in a no-deal Brexit if we leave without a deal. And I do not regret putting my job on the line to save my constituents' jobs. I do regret that the Prime Minister forced me to do it. What I want to say to Conservative colleagues is that no deal is not the end of Brexit. My honourable friend, the member for the Isle of Wight, yesterday said he wanted Brexit over to focus on other issues that matter to his constituents. I agree, so do I. I voted for the deal 3 times. But by keeping the threat of no deal on the table, it doesn't achieve this. And I say to my Prime Minister, the reason why your negotiations are undermined is not because of a no-deal Brexit, but because the Europeans cannot see the steps that you are taking to build consensus in this House and get any concessions given to you through Parliament. That is what puts you in the weaker position, not a threat of a no-deal. So without the public, without Europe seeing how you are trying to build consensus in this House, how this party, this government, this House, this Parliament is trying to work together to get a solution, you will not get concessions from Europe. And it is those people in this House that voted down the compromise, the withdrawal agreement, that have brought us to the brink of a no-deal precipice. I believe in the principle that our Parliament should have a say in one of the biggest questions of our times. Tonight we should stand up. I will give way.
Because I think she's on a point that hasn't been sufficiently emphasised. Does she agree with me that at root, the horrors we've gone through over the last 18 months, for those of us who find ourselves estranged from a party we loved, actually derived from the inability of successive governments to find a compromise?
I completely agree, and it's the inability of successive governments to work across the House, cross-party, to seek common ground, common agreement and common principles. And I am certain, I know many people in this place from all political divides, that there is a will and a way to get through. I just haven't seen the leadership from the front benches to argue for it. And that has been my biggest shame in being a member of this Parliament, in this House, for the last 3 years. Not seeing proper leadership out there to build our country back together again, to get people to work together, and to explain in our constituencies why we should honour the referendum result, but do so in a way that maximises the chances of a positive relationship with Europe and giving us the best foundations to build on for the future. And that's why I say that Parliament should have a say in the biggest question of our time. If we cannot get that leadership in the front benches, then Parliament needs to provide that leadership to the country.
Flint.
Mr. Speaker, and can I extend my best wishes to the right honourable member for Mid Sussex? I will miss our lift encounters occasionally in Portcullis House. But that's not... hang on, don't use up all my 3 minutes on this. That is not for today. Mr. Speaker, I have voted for a deal twice, and I would have voted for the withdrawal agreement bill. Probably, therefore, I voted for a deal more times than some prominent members of the present government. But I would have to say I've also opposed no deal more times than some of the ex-cabinet members and ministers who are now supporting this bill today. Because I have been trying to seek compromise, and a decision that we delegated to the British people on the UK's departure from the European Union has been dogged by a lack of compromise on all sides. Hardline Leavers and hardline Remainers have succeeded in turning a complicated decision into a crisis. And I'm afraid between them they are eroding the trust and the patience of the British people. Now, this debate today is born of the fear, understandably, that the UK will leave with no deal and that this will cause avoidable damage on our economy. It is born of a fear that the Prime Minister, and I hope I'm not using unparliamentary language here, Mr. Speaker, is insincere in his stated intention of reaching a deal with the EU 27. But others also have to be self-critical in this House. It is disingenuous to tell the public you are against no deal if you are really also against any deal, and indeed against Brexit. If the EU 27 can accept a deal, however revised, it must be better for the UK and the EU 27 than no deal. So I urge colleagues that if the amendments in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Aberystwyth, are selected today, that you support it, because what it does is tie an extension to securing a deal, which I think is the proper way forward. I will give way only once.
For giving way, and I pay tribute to her for the way in which she has sought compromise. Many of us have voted for deals of various kinds, and I agree with what she says about the approach set out by her honourable friend for Aberystwyth. I think it has considerable potential. But would she agree that one of the other reasons we should seek to resolve this by way of a deal, and do so quickly, is that the longer this argument goes on for, the more divided our society remains, and the harder it will be to knit it back together. And the danger of an approach that simply asks for a further extension without any real idea of what we will use the extension for is that that argument is perpetuated and the damage continues to be done.
And one of my greatest concerns in all of this, that in a referendum that saw such a massive record turnout, that there are many people, if we continue to thwart coming to a conclusion on this, a resolution, will never vote again. And that will damage our democracy for decades to come. I am saddened that some in this House think our only obligation is to the 48% and others think we only need to consider the 52%. I believe we need to respect the British people whether they voted Leave or Remain and whichever party they support. We must show them we can move forward and not simply block progress at every stage. I want to look my Leave voters in the eye and say, yes, I respected, as a Remain voter, the decision to leave. We have now left. We will regain control of our laws and borders. And to Remain supporters, who I stood alongside in 2016, I want to say, yes, we respected the decision to leave, but we have successfully protected the things that you value and I value most. Open trade with the EU, workers' rights, high environmental standards, rights for Brits abroad, respecting EU citizens working here, student exchange programmes, joint research projects. I could go on. All of these can be secured, but only with a deal. No deal is a decision, but one that defers 100 decisions. And I urge the government to secure a deal before the 31st of October, and I'm willing to work every day and every hour to make that happen. But I say to colleagues, you also have to show some compromise as well. You must link an extension to securing a deal, because an extension with no purpose is not the way forward.
Order. I would like to call 2 more speakers, but I want the Secretary of State to be on his feet no later than 4:50. Sir Edward Lee.
Pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady, and I think I agree with virtually everything she says. And it's a pleasure to listen to my right honourable friends for North East Bedfordshire and Mid Sussex, with whom I've served here for 36 years. And I know they don't want to stand again, but if they were standing, I would want to stand with them shoulder to shoulder as a Conservative candidate. There are procedures for dealing with this sort of issue, but I very much hope that those like my right honourable friend for Runnymede, who did vote for their conscience, I don't agree with him, but who did vote for their conscience, can find a way to stand again for our party. The trouble with purges is if you purge one group of people, you may have to purge another group of people, for instance, when you try and push a deal through Parliament. So I think we do need compromise. Indeed, that's the whole point of what I want to say today. I'm in a bit of a minority here, because I am a Brexiteer. My constituency voted 62 to 38% for Brexit, but actually I voted for this deal 3 times. We hear so much from people how terrible no deal is, but so many people in this place voted against the deal 3 times. We could have had Brexit by now. This whole thing could have been resolved. And I want to still resolve it. I still believe that it is perfectly possible to make progress in these negotiations in the coming weeks. So much ink has been wasted on the backstop, so much debate on an issue about something that will never happen. I don't believe, and I don't think anybody believes for a moment, the backstop will ever happen. Nobody intends to impose a hard border, and there are so many ways we could resolve this. I think that we are actually this close to resolving this issue. And there's been so much talk about how we don't trust the Prime Minister, he wants no deal. I genuinely believe that he and the Cabinet want to achieve an orderly Brexit. But the problem they face at the moment is that the present deal simply can't get through Parliament, so they have to make progress. We had the Brady Amendment. We can win a vote in this place. I don't want to make a bore of myself by going on about devices such as the Vienna Convention. I mentioned them many times, but they're all possible. The trouble with this bill is that if it is passed, and I know this has been said many times before, but it's an unanswerable point, there is absolutely no incentive for the EU to make any progress on this. And therefore it drives a coach and horses for our negotiating tactics. And I end with an argument that might appeal to the Labour Party. In the October 1957 Labour Party conference, Anara and Bevan said, if you pass this motion, which was on unilateral disarmament, you will send the Foreign Secretary naked into the conference chamber. That is what we will be doing if we pass this bill. So let's compromise, let's draw together, and let's get a deal.
Justin Madders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Vauxhall Motors in Ellesmere Port has been producing cars for over 50 years. It employs around 1,000 people, with many thousands more in the supply chain and associated business. But statements made by the parent group over the summer have made it crystal clear that the plant's very existence is dependent on the UK avoiding a no-deal Brexit. We know the plant faced challenges, every car manufacturer does, but in the past, with the help of the government, management and the unions, everyone has pulled together to make it work. But now we have the absurdity of the government actively pursuing a policy which will destroy the industry. WTO terms mean a 10% tariff on all car exports, and around 80% of the vehicles built in Ellesmere Port are exported to the EU. We know the plant just won't be able to compete with other plants across Europe with a 10% albatross around its neck. So it's as stark as that. No deal means no Vauxhalls. And I've always said I would abide by the outcome of the referendum, but that does not mean I will do so at any cost, and certainly not at the cost of my constituents' jobs. And that is where we are now. The government are effectively asking me to put my constituents on the dole queue, and I can't in all conscience do that. And I'm astounded that any government would choose that course of action. So let's be clear about where we are. The Conservative Party, which used to have the reputation as the party of business, has purged itself of 21 members for voting against a policy which they know could knock 10% off the economy. If anyone had said a year ago that's where we would find ourselves, I wouldn't have believed you. But such is the reckless ideological madness that we have on the benches opposite. That is exactly where we are today. The Prime Minister tells us that he cannot negotiate with the EU if no deal is taken off the table. But given he claims the primary change he wants to make is on the Irish backstop, which is a very specific issue, there seems to be no connection between the changes he says he wants to make and need to keep the threat of no deal on the table. And I'm also, as many members here are, at a loss to understand how he can reconcile his statement yesterday that the first thing the EU asks in respect of any proposals made by the government is whether they have the support of Parliament, with his refusal to actually share his proposals with Parliament. How can he say we would support his proposals if we don't even know what they are? And it's not just the automotive sector in my constituency that is under threat. Aerospace, chemicals, petroleum, to name but three, employ thousands of people in the area whose jobs are at risk from a no-deal Brexit. I've just come from a briefing by the Road Haulers Association who clearly said the sector is not ready for a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October. They say with just 42 working days left, they still don't know what the customs documentation processes will be or who they can go to for advice on it. They're doing what they can, but at the moment we face haulage businesses going bust and food rotting on lorries because it cannot be delivered in time, let alone the effect it will have on medicine supplies. So let's, as a country and as a parliament, pull ourselves back from the edge at the 11th hour. Let's have a moment of clarity, let's have a moment of reason, of compromise, so we don't force Brexit through by the 31st of October, regardless of the consequences, because those consequences will be devastating, they will be enduring, and they will do nothing to heal the deep divisions that have led us here in the first place.
Exiting the European Union, Secretary of State Stephen Barclay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I begin by paying tribute to the new member for Brecon and Radnorshire, who spoke with great distinction on behalf of her constituency. And as they indicated it may be their final speech in the House, may I, just on a personal note, pay tribute to my colleagues, the member for Mid Sussex and the member for North East Bedfordshire, who have served with great ability and courtesy throughout my time in the House. The central issue, Mr. Speaker, before the House with this bill is whether indeed the government's negotiation is sincere and deliverable. The opposition have continued to refuse both to support a deal but also make clear that they will rule out a no deal, and as the member for Don Valley pointed out, there is an inherent contradiction in that position. The problem with this bill, Mr. Speaker, as my right honourable friend the member for Gainsborough made clear, is there is no incentive on the EU to move, because the bill gives the EU complete control of the outcome of these talks. And let me remind the House that President Tusk and others within the EU have repeatedly said that they do not want the UK to leave. Indeed, he said if a deal is impossible and no one wants no deal, then who will finally have the courage to say what the only positive solution is? So let's not be in any doubt. Those on the other side of the negotiation do not want the UK to leave. They don't want to lose the 12% of the financial contribution to the EU budget that the United Kingdom pays, the £1 billion a month that this extension will cause, and therefore, in short, there will be no incentive for the EU to move. And this, in practice, will be legislation that will act as purgatory and endless delay. I'll happily give way.
For giving way. Well, of course, it was the government's own chief advisor who described the negotiations as a sham, so we know what's really going on. But I'd like to ask the Secretary of State, is it true that members of the government legal service have been requested to provide advice in the last 2 days on all tactics possible to avoid this bill receiving royal assent? Is that true, yes or no?
The Prime Minister addressed the issue on his statement yesterday in terms of royal assent, and ministers abide by the code. But he says that the negotiation is a sham. And yet one should look at what the Commission themselves have said. At Strasbourg, they said that alternative arrangements had merit as an alternative to the backstop. Just last month, the Council pledged in its official guidelines on Brexit negotiations, and I quote, flexible and imaginative solutions. Senior European figures claim that the backstop will not be required. For example, the former German MEP, a member of the European Parliament Brexit Steering Group, said, and I quote, there was a 99% chance that a backstop would never be used. And indeed, the issue arises because of the sequencing of the talks at the choice of the European Union themselves that left insufficient time for the negotiation when this issue should be addressed as part of the future economic relationship. Now, Mr. Speaker, in addressing issues such as the claim made on the benches opposite, it's worth reflecting on the fact that the EU have moved in their position from the language of no change at all to the withdrawal agreement to now saying, well, there can be changes if legally operative text on alternative arrangements can be made. And it's worth contrasting Donald Tusk's comments in June that nothing has changed when it comes to our position to President Macron's comments last month saying he was very confident that the UK and EU would be able to find a solution if there is goodwill on both sides. I give way.
For giving way. Isn't the truth that members on that side of the chamber, no more than members on this side of the chamber, just do not trust the Prime Minister? When he went to Berlin on the 21st of August, he committed to presenting a deal within 30 days. We're now a third of the way through that timetable, and the truth is, there is no deal. That's the problem.
He says that it's about trusting this Prime Minister. He voted against the deal that the previous Prime Minister brought back 3 times. And where the trust is lacking, in those who trusted the Labour manifesto that promised to respect the referendum result. Now, it's worth, Mr. Speaker, looking at the communiqué. I'm sure members will have read the communiqué from the Commission issued at lunchtime today. And they'll see in that communication, firstly, very little detail from them on the Irish border. Secondly, that its objective in a no-deal situation would be, and I quote, to be a more stable solution for the period thereafter. So indeed, their own communiqué falls short of the demand for an all-weather, all-insurance, legally operative text to which they have set as a condition to the United Kingdom. Legal text by the 31st of October will, of course, set out detail. But the test needs to be one which involves creativity and flexibility on both sides. It also needs to reflect the fact that the operational detail will be shaped by the joint committee during the implementation period itself. And as an illustration of this point can be seen in the response to detail presented by the previous government, and the Right Honourable Member for Runnymede spoke about his concerns in terms of detail. But he will well remember that set against an all-weather test, simply presenting detail against that test led the Commission with the previous government to dismiss that purely as magical thinking. In terms of progress, I'll give away one last time.
Thank you. Patience has been rewarded. I'm enormously grateful to the Brexit Secretary for allowing me to intervene in him. The Brexit Secretary will be well aware that the Prime Minister has claimed in August that the backstop contravenes the consent principle in the Good Friday Agreement. would the right honourable gentleman take the opportunity today to correct the record?
Right.
To correct the record that the backstop in no way compromises the consent principle in the Good Friday Agreement. I think that's very important to have it on the record.
There's two issues that speak to that point. Firstly, the concern the Prime Minister has as to the rule-taking element of the backstop, where those in Northern Ireland will continue to take rules in the backstop over which they would not have a say. And secondly, the element of consent from both parts of the community in Northern Ireland, and the concern that that is undermined by concerns in the community. And to address her earlier intervention, because she also made an intervention in respect of contact with the Irish government, the Prime Minister is discussing the issues around the alternative arrangements with the Taoiseach on Monday, and that builds on considerable other interaction with the Irish government. For example, I had a meeting with Simon Coveney in the Irish Embassy in Paris, I think it was last week, and the Foreign Secretary met him as well in the same week. So there's been extensive contact with the Irish government. The Prime Minister's EU Sherpa, Mr. Speaker, is in Brussels today. He had the last round of technical talks last week. He will have further talks on Wednesday exploring much of this detail. But the detail needs to be in place at the end of the implementation period, which is the end of 2020, or even potentially, by mutual agreement, a further 1 or 2 years. So that timescale is realistic and it is negotiable. Mr. Speaker, the bill, we're very happy to talk about the bill. The issue for him is he talks about voting against a deal. He talks against no deal, and he should come clean and admit that actually what his position is he is opposed to Brexit entirely. Mr. Speaker, the public want Brexit delivered. The business community want certainty. This bill will leave our negotiations in purgatory with a third extension after more than 3 years. Much has been made, Mr. Speaker, about parliamentary time, about the period between now and the 14th of October. But the EU themselves say that a deal would not be struck until the 11th hour, that it would take the EU Council decision on the 17th to reach a decision. So the issue is not the time that is spent in September, the issue is the time between the 17th of October and the 31st of October. Mr. Speaker, over the summer, this new government has narrowed down its negotiating asks as set out in the letter to President Tusk. It's targeted its request on the withdrawal agreement and a best-in-class FTA. This is a bill that is intended to stop Brexit. I urge colleagues to oppose it.
Order, order. Under the order of the House agreed yesterday, I am now required to put the question. The question is that the bill be read a second time. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division! Clear the lobby. Order. Order. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as are that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Now tell us for the ayes. Jeff Smith, his name appears earlier in the alphabet, and Nick Smith, Mr. Stuart Andrew and Mr. Ian Stewart. Order.
The ayes to the right, 329. The noes to the left, 300.
Well done, Nick. The ayes to the right, 329. The noes to the left, 300. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. Order. Under the terms of the order of the House yesterday, we shall now move to Committee of the Whole House. Order.
Right, where's my piece of paper?